Well, thanks for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, South Africa continues to see an increase in the number of people who rely on social welfare. And with the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, more than 31% of the population now officially depends on some form of monthly grant. And this is in addition to an existing Statistics South Africa report that 30.5 million South Africans live in abject poverty. And with no clear end in sight with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, even more households continue to look to government as financial sustainability decreases. And of course, the employment opportunities seem bleaker than ever. And this then begs the question, what is the sustainability of about 1/3 of the population of this country living on grants? And to help us unpack this, we're joined by our former Statistician-General, Dr. Pali Lehohla. Thanks so much for your time, and good to speak to you again here on Morning Live.
Good morning, and may you be safe and healthy. I don't think that should define the new happiness.
Indeed.
Safety and health are the happiness index, I think.
That is indeed our new setting. But there are so many worrying factors that we are contending with at the moment, Dr. Lehohla. And if you look at it, first and foremost, almost a third of the South African population now looking at government, now dependent on some form of social grant. How sustainable is that?
It is not sustainable in an environment where the working population is shrinking and the tax base is also shrinking very, very fast. As a transition measure from apartheid to democracy, it was going to take longer, but it provided that our strategies and tactics deliver a different outcome. But unfortunately, in the last 10 years, the outcomes have been more debilitating and driving us to a situation of desperation, which precipitates, therefore, the unsustainable nature of the path we have followed. I'm encouraged by coronavirus in terms of just projecting a reset, a different future. But the discussion and negotiation of that must be in the space of coronavirus. We mustn't wait for something called post-corona, because we'll never get it right if we try to do that. So the time is now to actually deal with this pandemic of jobs, unemployment, and inequality and poverty in South Africa. That's the time to deal with it. And the levers are not very far to realize, given where South Africa is in terms of just the education level or the skill level of the people. It all starts with education. If we address education correctly, these should be answered. It will not be answered, surely not this year and next year, because education is a generational issue. But if we get the right point of departure in education, we'll get it right. For instance, you can't appoint 300,000 teaching assistants and think that you are solving the problem of education. You actually have to train those people thoroughly first and train them for the new future, rather than trying to do a kids kind of teachers like you did with apartheid police. That strategy is deemed to fail in a country where we know how toxic the environment, even in the teaching environment, is. Now, if you add a burden of teachers' assistants, then you will get even a worse situation of contestation and everything, and you are bringing conflict in the classrooms. We need a better strategy for that. I think we still need the 300,000, but train them well and make them the future of the country and be deliberate about that, not an emergency kind of situation. Those are kinds of things that I think we are not dealing with that well.
If we stick with that as an example, Dr. Lehohla, we didn't get here overnight. You know, these problems have been there. They predate the COVID-19 pandemic by quite some time. And then you also speak of that triple threat, that axis of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. which we have failed to make any real inroads into as a nation. And when I say real inroads, I mean in terms of not seeing the numbers rise in terms of poverty and unemployment, for example, and going in the opposite direction. We have failed as a country to do that in any meaningful way. So what needs to change today, apart from the example that you've just given us, to make sure that we put ourselves on a better trajectory as a nation?
Well, I mean, there is something called, I saw in the NDP, called course correction. There is no course that NDP traversed, and therefore you cannot correct a course whose path has not been traversed. This NDP is on the bookshelves. It never left that bookshelf. And I think we are deceiving ourselves if we think we can correct the path of the NDP, because we never implemented it. That's another failed approach. That's another failed diagnosis. There's a problem in the country of diagnosing what the real problems are. There have been just too much patchwork of recycling policies that have never been even tested. So the issue is about policy design and systems thinking. That systems thinking can actually help us, lift us out of the morass of this recycling of policies and making promises that are not achievable,
but
and
Dr.
not facing
Lehohla,
the reality.
Who's supposed to do that? Are we expecting the same people who have failed to do that now?
We have an elected government that should lead in this space. And planning is not something that you play with. Planning requires competencies. It's not something that you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to plan. It's something that you put people who actually are competent in design thinking and thinking ahead 40, 50 years from now. There is not a plan in the country that talks to that from a point of education, jobs, and so on. If you look at the State of the Nation address, the budget speech, they say nothing about jobs. They say nothing about unemployment. If they do, it's a pittance, 100,000 jobs a year, and you have 10 million people unemployed. That cannot answer the question. And it shows the poverty of thinking, the poverty of policy design. So there is that we have to confront. And now if we say that there is course correction, you can even see a deeper crisis in the National Planning Commission about understanding what crisis we are facing. You cannot talk about course correction in the NDP, which never actually left the shelves. It cannot be course correction.
So it just seems to get worse and worse by the minute, because you talk about that shrinking tax base and it's continuing to shrink, especially as a result of COVID-19. And then to add to the already significant social grant needs, you now have the COVID-19 costs that the country has to bear, and economists are talking about a fiscal cliff. Is that an exaggeration at this point?
Well, I mean, surely there would be a fiscal cliff in a particular approach to economics. Let me talk about Indlamete scenarios, where, as we saw the situation in South Africa deteriorating, we said, let's step back and come up with scenarios. And scenarios actually tell you what the future looks like. Unfortunately, the president of the country in 2018 was there to launch this effort of scenarios, which gave us options, which is Barabara, which means a floundering New Dawn, which is a Isbujwa, which is continuing on the path, and Naila Walk, which means a change South Africa. These scenarios are not new. There have been scenarios at the time of 2000, which projected into this future, which included Shosholoza, the memories of the future, and so on. If we do not stick to looking at scenarios, we are not going to go anywhere. And these scenarios that were presented are showing a worse situation. And the scenario Naila Walk, which we are looking at, which Gauteng itself, when it looked at its projects and its development, adopted this, it had a very clear path and is reviewing that to look at this path in the context of Corona. So unless you have a scenario process that gives you a perspective of about 20 or 30 years, you really are navel-gazing and you cannot get out of the problems. And these scenarios are not just scenarios, they have to be undergirded by econometric modeling and plans and testing those and allowing these policies to be debated by society and choices be made. These calamity scenarios reach to lower levels of geography, including municipalities. So they connect national, province, and so on. And this is how the Chinese beat their problems. This is how all other countries beat their problems. But in South Africa, we look at scenarios. I mean, when the new government came in 2009, they dropped focusing on the scenarios. And we wavered from the path all the time up to now. Scenarios which actually projected this kind of situation. The Skedonk scenario actually portended this kind of situation. And we went into it with our eyes open, and we continue in that path. So scenarios help you to wake up and say, is this path the path I'm choosing deliberately? Yes, of course, if you continue on it, you are deliberate about it. And so we have been deliberate about it.
So if we're being honest about where we find ourselves right now, Dr. Lehohla, do we actually have the leadership that can actually take seriously these scenarios? Because, you know, we spoke, for example, at length to Professor Somadoda Fikeni on various occasions. I think you yourself have also spoken about these Indulamiti scenarios, and as you say, others as well. They are there. Everybody knows they're there. We've discussed them. Government is aware of them. They've commissioned some of these works. So do we actually have the leadership that is capable of actually taking that and changing the trajectory of the country based on these projections?
When the crisis hit South Africa in 1993 and Chris Hani got killed, Nelson Mandela declared the date of the election. And from then, he was the president. It was just a matter of formality to go through the elections. That's what leadership is required. That leadership doesn't exist today. We are actually navel-gazing, running around the totem, coming with a state of nation after state of nation that actually talks about nothing. So we need to be very, very factful about ourselves. I mean, how many times has the ENC since 2012 said that they are going on a reflection session, reflecting? I mean, those are some of the abused words in the country. It's like a Bruce Lee film where the reflections are mirrors, infinite images of Bruce Lee, and you don't know who the real Bruce Lee is. We really need to get out of that smoke and mirror fashion of doing things. This crisis is real. So we need a very different way of looking at things. We cannot talk about factories that are coming and forget that about factories that close. Only Statistician can tell you that things are happening and things are not happening. If you emphasize only what you see you are doing, inputs, and not looking at outcomes, you'll never get out of this morass. So many a time we have had investment summits, and these investment summits have not generated the kind of growth that we are talking about. And investors, when they come into this, they hobnob with politicians. They talk about what they are going to do. What the question should be to the investors is, from the government, is this new money, or is it just continuing on the path that we have continued? And most of the time you find that it is not new money. It's basically about replacing existing retiring equipment. So let's not be deceived by people who say we'll spend so much. What we need is a real new money to get South Africa out of this morass. If you look at Brazil and South Africa, part of the unemployment problem that we face in South Africa, the big difference is in agriculture, the contribution of agriculture, both in employment and in the GDP. In South Africa, the GDP contribution is very small from agriculture. So is unemployment, although relative to GDP, the unemployment proportionate or employment proportionately that agriculture makes is much bigger than the contribution it makes to GDP. But we have to look at that and say, what are we going to do with agriculture given that we have a population that is not so skilled at the moment? While we deal with transitions, how do we deploy this population so that it can be productive? We are not doing that.
And then, Dr. Lehohla, as we wrap, economic projections that were made last year actually emphasized more job losses, and we actually continue to see that. So what will it take? As you say, we need to look at what we have at our disposal differently, like agriculture, but we also have other natural resources. And even if there was a strategy, how long do you think it will actually take for us to start seeing tangible results of a recovery?
Einstein says if he had a problem that is pressing, he would spend 95% of that time planning and 5% in implementation. We twist the other way. We take 5% in planning and then a 95% fumbling around implementation of plans that are not correct, that are not plans at all. How many plans have we had in this country since 2000? We had the RDP, we had the GEAR, we had the New Path, we had the NDP, we had all these things there. I counted 12 of them, and we are 25 years now. So it's every 2 years there is a toy for the nation. We cannot build a nation on toys. We need a serious plan that looks at 40 years, and the NDP was such an effort, but it has been frozen in its mother's womb. It has never been born. And we say now we want cost correction. Cost correction of something that has never been born? It can't be. We are deceiving ourselves. So we should get out of this level of deception, go into the real world of how do you conceive of a plan. And that plan requires skills, it requires modeling, it requires commitment. How many years have we been there and Treasury has revised these projections downwards all the time? How much of policy discourse do we have in South Africa, particularly in economics? This is the preserve of a few. And that path, even if it gets challenged, people don't listen. And we continue on the same path of liberal policies that have failed. It can't be. We need to change course. Change course in terms of our planning systems, not cost correction for the NDP. It never went out of the shelf.
And we are out of time, Dr. Lehohla, but just a quick final one. Do we have the requisite resources to actually fund this recovery?
Well, I mean, South Africa is very rich. Where do the financials, we have financialized the economy. And these people are financializing the economy, ensuring that if the button gets hit and crisis hits, they are able to run away with the money. It's not a question of no resources. It's a question of a credible plan in front of everybody, discussed and negotiated, and then implemented faithfully. Because all South Africans are here in South Africa, black and white. But if we don't have an organizing framework that creates the conditions and the social compacts that are necessary, that promises a child born today that their futures will be different. By the way, today, 27 years after Nelson Mandela was out of prison, spent 27 years, we have to be asking ourselves in terms of those timelines, what the next 27 years will be like. We are not asking those questions. And we should be asking those questions about the child born today, what will be their 27 years to come. We are not asking those questions. We are talking about course correction on the NDP, instead of asking very, very deep questions of what the future of that child will be. That will be the basis for better planning, because we'll have to confront whether that child will traverse the path of Nelson Mandela in prison for 27 years of democracy, and then the next 27 years. If we look at all that, I think we'll wake up better.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. We have to leave it there. Former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla talking to us about our social welfare needs and, of course, the sustainability or not of about 1/3 of the population living and being dependent on some form of grant from government. Let's take a break.